The Monsters That Made Us is brought to you by the Cage Club Podcast Network. For all things movies, music, media, monsters, and more, head on over to cageclub.me. That's cageclub.me. Today we're heading to Whitby, where the mysterious Count Dracula has arrived from Transylvania and taken residence in Carfax Abbey. Almost immediately, he begins to prey on the vulnerable Mina Van Helsing. Yes, you heard that correctly. And it's not long before Dr. Seward's daughter Lucy is also captivated by his charms. With Mina dead and Lucy's connection to Dracula growing stronger every day, Dr. Seward and Jonathan Harker must rely on the aid of Mina's father, Abraham Van Helsing, to stop the Count once and for all. Stock up on some crucifixes and holy water and join us as we discuss Dracula.
To a new world of gods and monsters.
Listen to them, children of the night.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
You're crazy to know who I am, aren't you? I'll show you who I am and what I am.
You're insane. I tell you, I killed a wolf, a plain, ordinary wolf.
By studying these and other species, we add to our knowledge of how life evolved, how it adapted itself to this world.
He went for a little walk. He should have seen his face.
Welcome to the return of The Monsters That Made Us, the podcast where we celebrate the spooktacular characters and films in the Universal Studios Classic Monsters series. Today we'll be discussing 1979's Dracula, starring Frank Langella, Laurence Olivier, and Donald Pleasance. I'm the invisible Dan Colon, and joining me as always is my co-host, the king of his kind, Monster Mike Manzi. How are you, Mike?
We live, Dan. We're back. We're back from our summer break. Good to see you, man. Good to be here.
Yeah, so now we're officially back after, 5 months? I'm excited to be back talking Universal Monsters with you.
Yeah.
I hope our listeners are as excited as I am for what we have in store this season.
Yeah, I mean, I know I'm super excited to be back. I'm really pumped. Glad we're starting back here with a Dracula movie also, like The King. Awesome.
Yes. When last our listeners heard us, we had closed out our first season with the third and final creature from the Black Lagoon film, 1956's The Creature Walks Among Us, which was also the final monster film Universal produced during that original run of monster films that began, at least for our purposes, in 1925 with The Phantom of the Opera starring Lon Chaney Sr. In all, Universal produced over 75 horror films in that time, with 1960's The Leech Woman being the proverbial nail in the coffin for Universal horror. But as we know, monsters never really stayed dead. By this time, Dracula, Frankenstein, the Mummy, and the Wolfman were already finding a second life in the UK. British company Hammer Film Productions almost immediately began with their own string of gothic horror films, which began in earnest with 1957's The Curse of Frankenstein, soon followed by Dracula, known to American audiences as Horror of Dracula in 1958, and so on. Now, we will get to the Hammer horror films. I promise you. They're definitely high on my list. I really want to talk about them.
Yep.
But this season, we're going to stick with Universal. We're going to stay with them. And we're going to jump all the way to 1979 when they began revisiting these characters again. Obviously, we're talking about Dracula tonight, and we're going to continue all the way to the present day. That'll catch us up to what Universal's been up to with these characters. And then from there, we can start exploring what other people have done with these characters.
Yeah, that's the other thing. Like, Universal's been making other horror movies and such, like Psycho and Jaws and things like that too. But we're sticking with these monsters for now. So, we're going to go through the entire history of Universal, these releases that we're recording now. And after that, we'll get on to other things.
We will be, quote unquote, ending with The Last Voyage of the Demeter. But as Universal continues to put out films that connect to these characters, we will continue to put out episodes. But that'll catch us up to where we are now as we record today in 2023. To give a little bit of a disclaimer here, things get a little bit muddy with this period of film history. I've done my best to account for all of the Universal monster films, specifically the films that the studio produced. So I'm not talking about smaller indie films, maybe foreign films that Universal acquired and then distributed. I'm talking about films that they actively put into production. The goal is still to follow along in that chronological order. So if I've missed anything, please feel free to let us know by emailing us at themonstersthatmadeus@gmail.com, and we will do the best we can to include anything we may have missed and correct any mistakes.
Yeah, we're counting on our loyal fans this season to help us out a little bit, just in case we miss something.
As a reminder, we're fans, not experts, and
Right.
there's no singular Universal Monsters database that keeps track of all this information. So I'm doing it all myself, and again, totally fallible. I want to make sure we include everything. So please write to us if we miss something. Okay, Mike, so we're jumping ahead 23 years from where we left off, but we're back in familiar territory. Just like Tod Browning's 1931 film, this Dracula is also based on Hamilton Dean and John L. Balderston's play, as well as Bram Stoker's novel.
Nice.
Right off the top, what are your general thoughts on this version of Dracula? Had you seen it before? And how do you think it compares to Tod Browning's film?
Okay, so it was confusing at first. I gotta admit, I ended up watching it twice, logging it once, but watching it twice. Yeah, like I dig a lot of it. Like I really liked a lot of it. I think it looks awesome. We gotta talk about like the colored version or the supposed like different color timed versions. I think I watched the retimed one because it was almost black and white.
Mm-hmm.
I think that helped tremendously. Visually, I think like you couldn't have done better. Like directing wise, it felt kind of like it was on the fence. Like it had a chance to go like either super campy or super horror, and I feel like it tried to do both. It's wild. The renaming of characters and recharacterization of some of these characters and the differences of them is a little jarring.
Mm-hmm.
I get used to some of it. I like some of it more and I like some of it less. All in all, I think I like this one more than I was prepared to. I give it a lot of guts for changing what it changes,
Yeah.
for doing what it does. It's somehow more condensed, but also a longer film, scratching my head.
Right.
All in all, I had a really good experience watching it.
Yeah, it has solid bones, right? I mean, it's using
Yeah.
the same source material that the original 31 Dracula had, and I like it for a lot of the reasons that I like the original Dracula. The stuff that I really like. The direction here is a little bit weak, maybe is the right word.
We got to talk about John Badman.
I don't want to give off this impression that I think he is a bad director or incompetent, but I do think that he maybe had a star with a lot of opinions. And I think sometimes he didn't necessarily stick to his guns when he should have. And so the star sort of took over the production. Some of that struggle is evident on the screen.
Yeah, the star should be Dracula, right? Not the actor. And
Right.
I feel what you're saying. And he's coming off of what? Like Saturday Night Fever. Like they should be listening to him. I felt what you're feeling.
Yeah, I think that it's a lot of fun. I think that didn't need to be almost 2 hours long. I feel you on the runtime. I think overall I prefer Tod Browning's film for how tight it is. There's really no fat on that. Some may argue otherwise. There's no music and it's so quiet.
Yeah, it's hard. It's like all bones. Like talk about the bones of the story. Like that's, but that's the strength of it. It's to be able to survive off of its lack of anything else.
But this looks great. I especially, like you, I enjoy the muted colors here. There's some really great practical effects at work here.
Yeah.
Really great practical effects. And I kind of like that it's got a sequence. We'll talk about it, but it's got a sequence in there that sort of comes out of left field.
It's got a Bond title sequence.
Yes. I think in a lot of ways, this movie walked so that Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula could run.
Oh, absolutely feeling those vibes. And we got to mention the music too, right? Like John Williams was like bringing it. I get if there's some Superman vibes, I think, left over in his score, but all in all, like this, I feel like Coppola borrowed from this. Yeah.
Yeah. So overall, I am a fan of this. Yeah. Just generally speaking, really big fan of this Dracula.
Cool.
So I couldn't find a whole lot of information leading up to this project. So we'll just dive right into Dracula instead of talking about all the typical Universal Studio stuff. It's not like Universal was trying to revamp all these old monsters at this time. So what happened was producer Marvin Mirisch was a fan of the old monster movies, and he had just seen Frank Langella in the Broadway revival of the play, which it was an overnight hit. I think that went up in 1977, and immediately audiences loved it. And after he saw that, he pitched the idea to Universal. In Mirish's words, quote, "I truly had no idea what to expect, but I found that Langella had created a completely different character from the accepted sinister one, a character with charm, sex appeal, and most important of all, he endeared himself to the audiences. I decided right then to make the film."
Interesting how he followed in Bella's footsteps. They got the guy in the play to be in the movie.
Yes.
You know who they got to replace Frank Langella on stage, which I really wish they made a movie of?
Was he the immediate successor?
I believe so, but I can't confirm that. However, Raul Julia played
Yes.
Dracula on stage after, and I see the photos of that, and I'm just like, that would have been incredible.
Yeah, I would have loved to have seen some footage of Raul Julia as Dracula, because that's a perfect casting right there. So Marvin Mirisch was the executive producer of this film. He was originally from New York City, and he was one of two sons born to Josephine Francis and Polish immigrant Max Mirisch. His brother Walter and his half-brother Harold were also film executives, while his other half-brother Irving ran a company that supplied movie theaters with candy. So, like, all of these guys were involved in the movie biz on some level.
That's awesome. Even like the guy filling the concession stand.
Yep. In 1953, Marvin, Walter, and Harold worked for Monogram Pictures, later Allied Artists, before founding the Mirisch Company in 1957. Marvin doesn't have a long list of credits, but the most noteworthy of them that I found include Dracula, 1983's romantic comedy starring Dudley Moore and Mary Steenburgen, and the Pink Panther animated series, which ran 59 episodes from 1993 to 1996.
I loved that cartoon as a kid.
So at the helm, we sort of talked about him a little bit already, is director John Badham. He had just had his breakout hit 2 years prior with Saturday Night Fever when he replaced John G. Avildsen. After Dracula, he went on to direct Whose Life Is It Anyway?, War Games, Blue Thunder, and Short Circuit before transitioning to television. And I discovered he's currently a professor at Chapman University at the Laurence and Christina Dodge College of Film and Media Arts.
Wow, take that class, because I actually quite like this director and like a lot of the movies he's involved in, and like I remember quite a few of them growing up. So
yeah, his direction is great when he's allowed to direct.
I think visually, yeah, I think like for his sense of environment and all that, it's super on point. He's got a visual language that is definitely defined, for sure.
So the man responsible for adapting Hamilton Dean and John Balderston's play is W.D. Richter. Prior to Dracula, Richter adapted the 1978 remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Oh, cool. Okay.
He went on to write the screenplay for Big Trouble in Little China as well.
Okay, Dan, we're fans.
Yep.
Big fans.
And so, you know, like obviously I'm trying to keep this information as tight as possible. When I found this stuff out, I was like, this has to make it into the show. He was also the director of The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension.
I love this man.
Yeah, so he's got some serious credibility as far as you and I are concerned. But when he approached the character of Dracula, he decided to lean into the Vlad the Impaler connection, albeit somewhat subtly. There is like just kind of a brief mention of it, but he really liked this idea of a warrior, you know, with immortality and like what that might do to a man like him over time. And he wanted to portray Dracula as a lonely, more sympathetic character.
Interesting.
You're going to like this. Behind the camera, we've got Gilbert Taylor replacing Frank Tidy, who had found himself just a little bit out of his depth with a lot of the effect shots that the film called for. Gil Taylor, however, was more than up to the task, having shot The Omen and Star Wars just a few years prior.
And I just watched The Omen, and I'm always watching Star Wars.
And definitely the guy you want to call if you want to have, you know, practical effects shots.
Certainly.
As many as this film does, for sure.
That's a feature of this movie, is like the special effects.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're so much fun.
Yes, and we're going to talk about some of them before we get into the movie. Just because I thought it would tickle you to find this out about him, he also shot Dr. Strangelove, A Hard Day's Night, several Polanski films, including Repulsion, Cul-de-sac, and Macbeth. And he also worked with Hitchcock on Frenzy, and he shot Flash Gordon as well.
Wow. All right. Yeah. I mean, this guy I should have a picture of him on my wall, right?
He's actually been around for quite a while prior to Dracula. He began as a camera assistant at 15 years old and then worked as a clapper loader on Hitchcock's Number 17 in 1932.
Whoa.
And he was even trusted with some of the special effects work with the matte paintings for that film. So, yeah, this guy had a long career of effects cinematography before he got to Dracula.
Yeah, seeing like an entire career's worth of experience on screen.
For sure. Dracula was edited by Academy Award winner John Bloom. I really mention him because he was an Academy Award winner. He had won for Gandhi, but was also nominated for A Chorus Line and The French Lieutenant's Woman. And as you mentioned, John Williams wrote the score. The pedigree on this film, incredible.
Behind the scenes, like perfect recipe, right, for a great cake.
Yes.
Like, these are all the people, like the writers right on the cusp of what's going to be kind of cult. The producers into all the kind of same things. The director, yeah, he might have brought a little too much disco to this, but we'll see there. I think he brought Travolta's hair by accident. But like, yeah, I'm definitely excited.
Let's get into the cast. Of course, Frank Langella, the iconic Frank Langella as Count Dracula. We sort of talked about this. He was reprising his role that he had originated on stage in this new production of this sort of revival production, which was in a sense kind of totally new take on the show.
Did you mention this? Was this on Broadway? London or something?
This was on Broadway at the Martin Beck Theater. The original Lugosi production was at the Fulton Theater. Yeah, so he was on Broadway in 1977, creating this whole new Dracula. So basically the difference between the Lugosi production and this is that the original production was kind of a straight, for lack of a better word, interpretation of the script and kind of treated like a standard gothic horror production. But this version, the 1977 Dracula, was a little campier, sort of intentionally campy. All of the sets were designed by illustrator Edward Gorey. They were all black and white sets, and they were made to look like etchings, kind of like drawings. So it was super stylized, and I think Frank Langella had a whole new interpretation of the character, again, based on the same script Lugosi had. So yes, it's a revival, but also an entirely unique interpretation of the source material.
Kind of like they rebooting it for the modern age, for the new audience, for, the new sensibilities of the times. Like, it's been a long time since they've changed Dracula, because even those Hammer horror films, they're way more gothic. Like, I feel like they're way more violent and they're way bloodier and they're more, they're going for a different sense. I was expecting more of that from this, and this is not that. That's what I was sort of saying when we get into the film. Like, there's camp in the movie, but I really wanted it to go like all the way. I bet I would have liked to play more.
Well, we'll get into why it wasn't like that shortly. So this performance earned Frank Langella his second Tony nomination and would be the best known role for this early part of his career.
That seems to happen to people playing Dracula. Like, that's a career making role. It seems so. Quickly though, what's your take on this Dracula?
I really like it.
Okay.
Every time Dracula has been done as a sort of romance, including Francis Ford Coppola's version,
Yeah.
I don't buy the romance. I just don't believe it. This is the first time where I get it. And I think it's because Langella plays it not like a monster, but as a sad, lonely, immortal man. Yes, he's evil, but he has an undoubtable sexiness to him. Like, there's an effortless to his charm. And I totally can understand why, he walks into a room, or his Dracula walks into a room and the women just melt into the palm of his hand. That's a quality I have never seen from a Dracula before this. Or at least I've never seen it done better than this. This is the first time where I can accept that. So while I don't typically like Dracula, the story, as a romance, this one does it for me. This is one of the things I do like about this version, is that I can at least buy the romance.
I liked it as well. Like, there's something so breezy about his Dracula, like almost like he's not Dracula some of the time.
Right.
Or that like he even forgets, like there's more of like a quiet desperation, as sad as that. Like, I don't really want to say that. I don't know there's something more human about his Dracula, I think, is what I'm trying. Yeah, and I like that. Like, you feel like you're just getting Frank Langella some of the times. Like, just how would you deliver this? Yeah, okay. I don't know if I like this though. Like, he's from America. Like, where's that accent from, Count? But they never address his accent or anything. Like, it's never addressed. So there's something really cool about him just being him as Dracula. That's how I was seeing it anyway. You know, it was almost like if Jack Nicholson played Dracula, like he wouldn't do anything different. So it's almost like that typecasting where it's like, we want Frank for Frank, or whatever he's doing on stage, maybe more of his personality was shining through. But that's how I feel watching it. You know, I feel like I'm just getting like the guy sometimes, and not even like him playing the role. And I like that. Like, I kind of think that works.
I'm not going to say I prefer it over Lugosi. I think I still prefer Lugosi's version. He's more intense, but there's something that's a bit scarier to me about Langella's Dracula that doesn't need to snarl or become a visible monster to be scary. The fact that, like, we know he's Dracula, we know what he's capable of, and he doesn't feel the need to resort to that for shock value, for me, it makes it more scary.
Yeah, because there's times in the movie where he doesn't rely on like his Dracula stuff, and he still gets under like Jonathan's skin or this or that, right? Like,
Yes.
he's seducing Lucy in this one, and like she's asked at one time, "Are you like possessed?" And she's like, "No, he's just got me," you know, like I love this guy or whatever.
I love the way he reinterprets some of this dialogue, because there's very little of it that's consistent from this in the 1931 film. Two of the lines that carry over are, "I never drink wine," and the way Langella just sort of throws it away. I think as an actor, he had to have known that. It's like sort of watching a new James Bond. How's he going to deliver the Bond, James Bond line, right?
That's a really good comparison, actually, for like someone taking on the role, trying to make it something new.
You know, you're going to have to say, "I never drink wine." So how do you do it? And this, I love the way Langella just sort of tosses it away in conversation, doesn't let it stop him from enjoying the dinner conversation he's having.
Yeah, he never telegraphs.
And then there's the line, "Children of the Night, what sad music they make," which is a slight alteration of the original line. But still, I like the way he delivers that line. I read listened to an interview with W.D. Richter about that specific line. And that was his way of injecting some of that loneliness to make Dracula a little more sympathetic by the fact that he is not about the nightlife anymore. The night music is a sad thing to him. I like the way he plays this character using a lot of the same dialogue, but then creating something entirely new from what Lugosi had done.
It's cool how it works. It's cool how like this is another one of those characters you can reinterpret over time and like change. I mean, they didn't change him drastically, but like they found a new corner to sort of explore, and it's been so long.
Yes.
You know, a new approach had to be found. This was a good take.
Now, he had been performing Dracula for 8 months before he began work on the film.
That's it?
That's it.
Oh, okay.
He was initially reluctant to do the film for fear of being typecast. Upon accepting the role for the film, he had 2 stipulations. First, he refused to do any scenes with fangs and dripping blood.
Oh, I didn't even realize he doesn't pop any fangs.
No fangs.
Whoa, that worked.
Lugosi didn't either, but I don't think that was a Lugosi call.
Oh.
I can't remember.
Yeah.
That movie famously has no Dracula fangs. In this case, Langella just didn't want to do it. He didn't want to lean into that stereotype. He wanted to do something different from what other films had done. And he would not do any commercial promotions for the film either. Not as Dracula.
Oh, okay. So he wasn't going to go on the Tonight Show as Dracula and like bite Ed McMahon's neck. I get it. Like, we're trying to take this a little more seriously than that's the point, right? The point is to kind of rehab Dracula into something to be taken more seriously again.
We sort of talked about this, just to state it out loud. Langella was determined to distance himself from Bela Lugosi. No surprise. He once said of his interpretation of the character, quote, "I decided he was a highly vulnerable and erotic man, not cool and detached, and with no sense of humor or humanity. I didn't want him to appear stilted, stentorian, or authoritarian as he's often presented. I wanted to show a man who, while evil, was lonely and could fall in love." That's what he was swinging for, and I think he hit it.
You think about other movies made around this time about the lonely loner and stuff, and you get like Travis Bickle,
right,
or like the Zodiac, Dracula. It's such like a strange road to go down where you present or interpret that as like, well, there's this like killer underneath of that as well. Like, you know, he's quiet, but he's gonna snap.
Right.
I didn't really think of it in that way. I'm just kind of thinking of it now like that because it makes him more threatening.
It's a tough needle to thread. You know, I've said a bunch of times that like a lot of these romantic Dracula interpretations always fall short because I never get past the fact that Dracula is a monster, a murderer. And this movie somehow manages to get me past that and believe that he's a lonely guy looking to fall in love like anybody else. Corny as that sounds, it does it in a way that I'm okay with.
Yeah, he's just got like an affliction. I
Right.
feel that. Like it does come across at times when they sit down and actually try to like go into his backstory a little more like he's cursed. Like he does not enjoy being Dracula, it feels. Whereas like Bella, you kind of see him revel in it from time to time.
Right. Okay, moving on to Laurence Olivier as Professor Abraham Van Helsing. Iconic actor Laurence Olivier. So
Yeah.
I learned he was very ill at the time of filming this. I don't know a ton about Olivier as an actor.
Yeah.
Apparently he had been battling illness for the final 22 years of his life.
Wow.
And it was feared that he might not make it through the filming of Dracula.
He's from like a, older generation, but I definitely recognize the name and I've seen a lot of the stuff he's in, but I know him mostly from Clash of the Titans,
Yeah.
where he plays Zeus, and I was like, I'm sure that movie came out after this, but he looks like he's on his last leg in this and like, what's going on? Yeah, Marathon Man, terrific. But like when he came on screen, I was kind of surprised by his appearance, as how frail he was.
I think he's the only member of this cast who was a working actor when the 1931 Dracula was released.
How about that? That's a great stat.
At this time, his deteriorating health included thrombosis, which is a blood clotting disorder, and dermatomyositis,
Okay.
which is an inflammatory disorder affecting the skin and muscles. Symptoms can include weight loss, fever, lung inflammation, light sensitivity, and the formation of calcium deposits in the muscles and skin.
What was he doing on set? I have notes for this movie, but I think my biggest one is just make Donald Pleasance Van Helsing and let Laurence Olivier go to the hospital or go home for the day, and like he ends up doing most of the work anyway. And in my opinion, they commit a cardinal sin and they have Dracula kill this guy at the end of the movie. Like, that's not how it goes.
Well, that was a decision made, in case this movie got a sequel or any sort of continuation, that they wouldn't have to depend on Laurence Olivier to return as Van Helsing.
Interesting choice to be like, let's just like, have the most gruesome death in the movie, like the oldest man on screen.
So he actually lived to be 82 and he died in 1989. So he lived for like another 10 years.
And he worked a lot.
He worked up until he died. His last credit was 1989's War Requiem. Let's see, he died months before its release of renal failure. So he kept going. He was one of those guys that, he was going to work until he died, and he did.
There you have it.
I love Laurence Olivier. I don't love his performance as Van Helsing. I'm kind of with you in that he doesn't really seem up to the task here.
Not at all.
I think some of it has to do with the script, the decision to make Mina his daughter. So as soon as he enters the movie, he's a grieving father. That sort of takes away from his ability to be this incredible scientist of like fringe science and the occult and shit like that.
Right. Like it takes his conscience, like he needs to have that cleared and shit. And like this, he's like thinking about his daughter and stuff.
Yeah, definitely not my favorite Van Helsing. This made me appreciate Anthony Hopkins way more. I think his performance is just incredible.
I think I was expecting something a little more unhinged along those lines, but then I realized that is a very modern performance,
Yes.
I do love that version. But we got some of that in the original where Van Helsing is just like this uber confident doctor of the occult, and he'll just like spout these like crazy things at a dinner party and like get people to leave, and he'll be like, well, what's their problem? And like this guy comes in and like the whole movie he's looking for his daughter's killer. It's basically that movie for him.
So it's funny that you mention that you wish that Donald Pleasance was Van Helsing. So we'll move on to Donald Pleasance now. He plays Dr. Jack Stewart, of course. Walter Mirisch loved him in The Great Escape, which is an incredible performance if you've never seen that. And Mike, I know you've seen it.
Oh, yeah.
He really wanted him to be in this film. Now, Pleasance was offered the role of Van Helsing.
Oh.
But he didn't want to do it because he felt it was too similar to his character of Loomis in John Carpenter's Halloween, which had just come out the year before.
That's the point. Like,
Yes.
that's who Loomis was. Loomis was the modern Van Helsing. This would have been great to see like a Loomis in his prime or like an early version of that. But from like that perspective, I respect his decision, but he ends up basically becoming Van Helsing anyway. So,
Yeah. According to director John Badham, now I didn't know this, Donald Pleasance was a huge scene stealer.
oh,
Some might call him a quote unquote handkerchief actor. That's a term I had never heard before.
where you have like a piece of business that you're always fiddling with to get attention.
Basically, yeah. So early in the production, he had asked Badham if he could carry like a paper bag of hard candies, or as he called them, sweeties.
Oh, it's like the Brad Pitt thing where he's always eating.
Badham had agreed to it, not realizing what he had gotten himself into, and it became clear during the editing that
Mm.
Pleasance had used those candies as well as handkerchiefs and other props as a way to keep the focus on himself.
Oh man, the poor continuity person. They're keeping that.
I mean, he used that same strategy during the breakfast scene, and he's just grotesquely eating these runny eggs. So, like, any chance he got to sort of fiddle with a prop in some way, he would capitalize on it. And then, like you said, the continuity would be in jeopardy if they cut through it. So they had to kind of keep these moments in the film. And that, again, that just made it so that he was on screen more than his other co-stars.
That's sabotage. Crazy.
Yeah, interesting story about Donald Pleasance I had never heard before, but definitely fun information.
Totally.
As much as I kind of agree with you that he should have been Van Helsing, I do like his Dr. Seward.
No, he could have done. He kind of could have done the same performance the whole movie. Is how I feel about it too. Is like he kind of starts out that way at the asylum, running the show, like controlling all the madmen and women, and like it feels like he's. It doesn't feel like he's out of his depth or anything.
No. Okay, so the rest of the cast is primarily British actors, many of whom were unknown internationally. John Badham actually kind of enjoyed that because it allowed him as a director to sort of discover what his actors were capable of and find like hidden talents and things, which I guess has its appeal. Kate Nelligan is our Lucy Seward, and Jan Francis is Mina Van Helsing. That name swap, it originates with the play. I think we talked about that in our first Dracula
Oh
episode.
yeah.
For whatever reason, I can't recall off the top of my head right now, but the characters are swapped. And so what we know as Mina is Lucy in the play, and Lucy is Mina.
However, it's not Mina Van Helsing though.
Correct. Mina Van Helsing thing is unique to this movie. And I think probably an effort to keep the story contained, more insular, but I think it's unnecessary.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessary either. Like, because again, it created more of an issue when Van Helsing showed up. I get used to the switcheroo because at the end of the day, it's just pretty much a name. You just gotta like keep track of it, and it's all about the character.
Sure.
I think what they did with Mina was pretty interesting. Like Lucy's great, but like Mina's her friend who's like, it's so convenient that her dad runs the asylum. The house is attached to the asylum, and she seems to be kind of like sickly. It's almost like I don't know. There's like this weird thing where like she's so close to belonging on the other side of the door. There's something very weird vibes about that where like, did Lucy make friends with like a crazy girl? And then they gave her like privileges and, she's able to play in like the normal house. It was an interesting dynamic between the two of them. And then I really like Lucy because she's basically like a woman from 1979 dropped into like 19, whenever cars first were made.
Yeah, I actually looked it up because I love the way she plays the character. It felt very modern woman in this time period. I had to look it up because I didn't know it off the top of my head, but this was like 15 years, the setting, right? Because this is set in 1913. I don't know if they say it in the film, but every source I've read, it's like, this is 1913. So this was set 15 years before women's suffrage in the UK. So that sort of modern woman is gaining traction. So I loved the way she treats John Harker, the way she interacts with other men.
She's offered a job at like a law firm.
I specifically think about the scene when she dances with Dracula and the way she sees it. She's like, look, I'm just dancing.
Yeah.
Now that I think about it, I think the novel portrays Mina as a modern woman, right? That sort of same contemporary, progressive type.
I'm almost getting like a Mary Shelley vibe.
Almost positive that character trait was drawn from the novel. I know our friend John Brooks could tell us. John Badham and W.D. Richter kept the names consistent with the play. And then when asked why he had kept the names swapped from what we typically are familiar with, John Badham had said that they, quote, felt like Mina was a dopey name and that Lucy was kind of a nice name, end quote.
All right.
So it's not even a good reason,
Not at all. I think that was just like avoiding.
avoiding the question.
Yeah, or just like I don't have a real answer. Like you'd have just said that's the way they used to be, so we put them back.
So there's really no clean resolution there, unfortunately. So virtually unknown outside of the UK prior to making Dracula, Kate Nelligan was a prolific stage actor and a TV actor, appearing in Barefoot in the Park, The Count of Monte Cristo, and As You Like It, among many others. In the 80s, she moved to New York, where she earned 4 Tony nominations between 1983 and 1989 before earning herself a BAFTA in 1991 for Frankie and Johnny, and an Academy Award nomination for the film The Prince of Tides. She retired
Whoa.
from acting in 2010, and she's still alive today. Jan Francis began as a ballet dancer with the Royal Ballet Touring Company before becoming a TV actor, appearing in a number of BBC productions. Never really breaking out of the UK, she continues to appear in BBC programming to this day. She actually, I think, choreographed those dance sequences, like that in the early in the film when Lucy is dancing with Jonathan and then she's dancing with Dracula. So she contributed quite a bit to those sequences too.
Okay, because they're like night and day. Like
Yes.
when she's dancing with Jonathan, I am dying laughing. And then they like come up and like do that little peck when they kiss and like oh my God, it's so funny. But like and she's dancing with Dracula, it's like, okay, that's how normal people dance.
Right. And speaking of Jonathan Harker, he's played by Trevor Eve. Prior to Dracula, he had performed on stage at the Lyric and West End theaters, as well as the TV series Laurence Olivier Presents. Hey, there's Laurence Olivier again. Since Dracula, he's pretty much continued working in various stage and BBC productions, including High Society, A Doll's House, David Copperfield. However, he has also made some brief appearances in a few American films, including Troy and the 2010 film She's Out of My League, in which he plays the father of his real-life daughter, Alice Eve.
Oh, no kidding. Yeah, I know her from like new Star Trek movie.
I was going to say, Carol Marcus. Today, he's best known for his work in the BBC detective series Shoestring and Waking the Dead.
Cool.
Tony Haygarth is our Milo Renfield.
It's such a waste. Such a waste. And I like this actor's doing a good job, but they just have nothing to do with Renfield.
No, nothing whatsoever. Predominantly a character actor, Haygarth began on stage appearing in repertory theater, followed by the Royal Shakespeare Company and the National Theater. Most of his film credits are unknown to me. However, he did appear in I, Claudius in 1976. So there's that. He was the voice of Mr. Tweedy in the underrated 2000 film Chicken Run.
Okay, yeah, because he's got an amazing accent. Like as soon as he came on screen, I was like, more of this guy. As much as I was like, I hope this is Renfield, and they're like, hey, Renfield, and he's like, oh, I ain't moving this dirt, and like I was like, yes, and then he's kind of gone for most of the movie.
Yeah, so I mean, it's clear that they rewrote his character. He's no longer like a solicitor the way Jonathan Harker was. His whole story has changed, and that's fine. You know, I think it
Yeah,
streamlines
it's
the
fine.
movie a bit. Renfield doesn't need to be the precursor to Jonathan Harker, you know?
Yeah, I kind of like the idea that he's a hard luck case, and it just gets worse and worse for him. You know.
But you're right. There's really not much for him to do here, unfortunately. And then, of course, Janine Davitsky as Annie, the woman at the asylum who has the baby, and Teddy Turner as Swales, who is sort of the attendant in the play. What would you call him? Like a janitor or caretaker?
Oh yeah, an orderly maybe.
Sylvester McCoy plays Walter Myrtle. He's not listed in the opening credits, but if you're a Doctor Who fan, you know him as the Seventh Doctor. He took over Doctor Who in 1987, replacing Colin Baker, and remained until the series ended in 1989. Though he was initially considered for Milo Renfield,
Oh, that would have been great.
the role of Swales was actually cut in two so that he could still be cast in the film.
Oh, cool. At least they're like, we're getting you here one way or the other. You're going to be here.
He had friends in the production. So, yeah. So we get a little bit of Sylvester McCoy. They did shoot more with his character. I guess that's why he has a name. Presumably he has lines and is addressed at some point. But unfortunately, most of his performance didn't make it into the final cut. So we really just get what we get.
That's okay. I just like to pretend that like it's the doctor. Just like doing a little cameo. Like, yeah, I traveled back this one time to see like Dracula if he was real, and he was.
So Dracula was shot on location in England at Shepperton Studios at Black Park, Buckinghamshire. Cornwall was used for the majority of the Whitby exteriors, with St. Michael's Mount used for Carfax Abbey. And the exteriors of Dr. Seward's asylum were shot in Tintagel, which is also the birthplace of King Arthur. Fun fact. When designing the interiors of Carfax Abbey, production designer Peter Merton drew inspiration from the castles of the Mad King Ludwig, utilizing the big, huge archways.
Yeah, dude, this thing looks like the Batcave. It has those Gotham City heads everywhere, statuesque. There's even a giant bat. Was this where Renfield was living before? Who was living here like that didn't know eventually Dracula was going to buy the place because it's perfect for him?
So, as much as I love this production design, I have to say that to me, it doesn't make a ton of sense for Carfax Abbey to look this way. It makes all the sense in the world for Castle Dracula to look this way.
That's what they did, Dan, because we'll get into it a little deeper soon, but they skip all that Castle Dracula stuff.
Yes.
So they got to put it somewhere, and they put it here. Like, they moved Castle Dracula to Carfax Abbey, basically. And like, we're going to get those scenes we missed later in the movie.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but an abbey is like where nuns live.
Right? Yeah,
So,
it's not a castle
no.
or a ginormous mansion.
Right. So while I don't think it makes a ton of narrative sense, I do love the production design on this Carfax Abbey. It's incredible.
Yeah, and I also love the like geography between the two estates. Like I find that to be real. Like they should have just renamed it Carfax Castle or some shit because like it works so much better it being a livable place like this for the most part and being like where it is in relation to like the asylum.
Our costume designer for this one is Julie Harris, who had previously worked on Help and A Hard Day's Night, as well as Live and Let Die. But I love her costume design here, particularly. I mean, everyone mentions this when it comes to this movie, but towards the end of the movie, when Lucy is in a cell in the sanitarium, she's wearing this amazing gown with like bat wings. Gorgeous. But yeah, great costume design here. So I mentioned Live and Let Die. In fact, many of the crew on this one were regulars of the Bond films. They were just like local, film crews.
Yeah, and Donald Pleasance had been Blofeld by now, right? So, Blofeld.
Lots of Bond connections to this, which I think is pretty fun. Speaking of Bond, there's one specific effect shot that stands out. I sort of mentioned this earlier. It's the love scene between Dracula and Lucy.
Yeah.
John Badham wanted to use a smoke and laser effect. He had previously wanted to employ this sort of effect in Saturday Night Fever. However, the equipment was too large for it to be practical at the time. But by Dracula, it had become more compact. What he did was he borrowed units from The Who when they weren't using it for one of their concerts, and then that whole sequence was shot with their equipment and orchestrated entirely by Maurice Binder, who did create those iconic opening credits for Bond, everything from Thunderball to License to Kill. He worked a long time on those Bond credits. And then, of course, he created the iconic gun barrel sequence that started with Dr. No.
No. It's such a shock in the middle of the movie in the version I watched, which was like, very like gray washed, right? The color grading was like almost black and white. And then this happens. It almost made me wish like he made a lush, rich colored version of Dracula as well somewhere. It wakes you up in a weird way visually. And I wish there was just maybe a little more of this like used to interpret dreams or something. That would have been.
This sequence is really divisive for people who involved with the film, people who watched it. I think that whichever side of that fence you're on, I totally understand. I know Frank Langella was not a fan at all. However, John Badham, it was his idea. He loves it. I kind of enjoy it. It does stick out. I'm not sure if it's in a good or bad way. I don't know that I'm capable of being totally objective about it because I know Maurice Binder created it. So I kind of find that I like it, but it doesn't necessarily fit the aesthetic of the rest of the film, at least not this desaturated version, which I do like. So yeah, it's a strange sequence, but I do enjoy it. The film was released in July 1979, and even though it opened at number one at the box office, taking in $3.1 million in its first weekend, it ultimately grossed just $20 million in its run and was viewed as a disappointment by the studio. This could have been due to market saturation, since there were 4 other Dracula movies released that year, including Werner Herzog's Nosferatu the Vampire and Love at First Bite. Plus, you also had Thirst and Salem's Lot in there. I think there were like 7 vampire movies in total that year. If you ask the filmmakers, they'll tell you that Love at First Bite's comedic tone undermined the seriousness of this film, and audiences just weren't into it.
Yeah, that's exactly what they're trying to avoid.
It's sort of like making a James Bond movie the same year as Austin Powers. And that's sort of what happened with Bond, is that it became sillier than the parody. And perhaps in an effort to save face after the disappointing performance of the film, Donald Pleasance told Empire magazine in 1994, quote, "I've only done one Dracula, that very expensive one with Frank Langella. Lord Laurence Olivier and I were the doctor and the professor. We had a really good time, but it was an awful film. Larry and I did it for a laugh."
Oh, he called him Larry. Did it for a laugh. He doesn't feel like he's here for a laugh. He feels like he's working, and he's doing his business with the food.
Yeah. So we already sort of talked about this a little bit, but I can expand upon it. John Badham originally intended to shoot the picture in a stylized black and white to mirror the black and white scenic design of cartoonist Edward Gorey's sets and costumes of the stage play. But there were two issues with that. So first, it gets a little technical. It's more than I could really explain here, but simply put, the Technicolor dye transfer equipment that was required to achieve this effect had sort of been phased out both in the US and in the UK. Technicolor had subsequently sold everything to communist China in 1978.
Oh, whoops.
If they wanted those effects, they'd have to go to China to do it, and that just wasn't going to happen in 1979. And the studio had also refused to shoot the film in black and white. They preferred color. Instead, the theatrical cut, as you alluded to earlier, was in full color. They used mostly warm and golden colors. However, in 1991, when the film was released on Laserdisc, John Badham was able to go back and desaturate the color to achieve something closer to what he had originally envisioned. And so this is the most popular version of the movie. I think it's what's available on Peacock at the moment. It's on the Blu-ray that I bought. However, I know Shout Factory put out a Blu-ray a couple years ago that has both versions. So if you want to check out the full color version, you can check it out on that disc. I, however, kind of like the desaturated tones here. I feel like Hammer did so much with color that I'm okay with this having sort of a dark, almost black and white vibe.
I almost feel like this could have gotten away with being black and white at the time, because this is like around the time Raging Bull came out, and there were a few movies being released in black and white that were being considered more serious, so it would have given it that sense of like, we're supposed to take this a little more like seriously. Or what I was also thinking watching this, which no one would be thinking of then, is if it was black, white, and red. That would have been awesome. Kind of Sin City, but a vampire movie.
If the reds in this had been really amped up a little bit, that would have been cool.
I dig the black and white, trying to get as close to that as possible, because I think mentally, like, it just puts me there.
Yeah. The script doesn't stick so close to the play to make that Edward Gorey, like, sort of stylistic look makes sense. The script is actually very different from the play. Having read the play, I just reread it before we recorded, and the original 31 Tod Browning film sticks much closer to the play. The play is it's 3 acts. Let's see, the first act and the beginning of the third act are set in like Dr. Seward's study. The whole second act is in Lucy's boudoir. And then like at the end, they go down into Dracula's crypt to drive the stake through his heart. That's it. And we talk at length in our original Dracula episode about how this whole thing is like a couple scenes. Most of it is in Dr. Seward's little sitting room, whatever that is. So the original film evokes much more of the spirit of the play than this does. I don't think that Edward Gorey's style would necessarily suit the film that they ended up making. I'm okay with it not working out that way. So we don't have any makeup notes, no stunts that I can think of, but I did find a couple fun little special effects notes, and then we can get into the movie. To achieve Mina's death sequence when they're down in those like catacombs and Olivier runs her through with that long stake, the way they achieved that is that Jan Francis like sort of fell onto a collapsible stake, and then they had an inflatable tip on her back that was rapidly inflated so that when it all like happened all at the same time, it sold that idea of her being penetrated by the stake. Really effective.
Good ingenuity, too.
Similarly, in a scene later in the film when Van Helsing and Jonathan Harker are in Dracula's crypt trying to find him and they encounter him, Harker swings a shovel, strikes Dracula with a shovel, but like instantaneously, Dracula transforms into a vampire bat and like flies out of the room. And so the way they achieved that, which I think is really cool, very similar effect, they had created a life-size inflatable Frank Langella.
Oh my God, they love the inflatables.
They shot it from behind, right? So you don't see his face. But when Harker makes contact, essentially they do like a very rapid deflate to sort of sell this idea that he just instantly turned into a vampire bat.
Yeah, I buy it. He evaporated, or he himself just kind of deflated.
Without having to cut the camera, right? So
Yeah.
they did it all in the same shot, so it looks really cool. It happens so fast that, yeah, my eye buys it for a second. Finally, not really an effect, but worth noting, because I'm sure it was going to come up at some point tonight, Langella's eyes. Did you notice that he has vibrating eyes?
Yeah, I was listening to another sacrilege, I know, but I was listening to another podcast give a review of this, and they mentioned it as well, but I couldn't really pick up on it, to be honest with you. I knew he did this and he had asked for it to kind of be cut around, but that the director actually enjoyed it and thought that it would make him more sort of unnerving.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So apparently he suffers from an eye condition, which causes that. On set, he told John Badham, if you see it happening, let me know, and I can stop it. What happened was Badham just sort of let it happen because he thought it was really unnerving and effective, especially in the close-ups. And I agree with him. I think it's a really cool effect, kind of a happy accident. But those are my special effect notes, and that's it for as much background as I have on Dracula. A lot more than I thought I would find, to be honest with you. But I'm glad that we had plenty of stuff to talk about for this first episode back.
Yeah, me too.
We don't need to go through this scene by scene. People who've seen any version of Dracula kind of know the basic gist of the plot here.
Yeah, they mostly stick very close. They omit some stuff, but then they make it up later.
Yeah, so we can sort of go through it chronologically as much as we can, but more or less talk about the differences, things we like, didn't like, and so on.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really like that this one starts with the Demeter. There's no Transylvania whatsoever.
I'm not 100% in love with it, but I think it still works. I was missing the Transylvania stuff until I realized they're going to do it at Carfax Abbey, right? They do most of it. He signs the deed for Jonathan, which is what they cut, and he turns Renfield insane, which in another version is what they cut. So all that stuff kind of comes later, but I think that the Demeter stuff is awesome. The shooting of this whole sequence is thrilling. I think it sets you up for a movie we're not going to get, which feels more of an action horror movie.
Yeah, this is maybe the best depiction of the voyage of the Demeter that I've seen thus far, not including the entire movie they made about that section of the novel. Because I really like how it plays out in Tod Browning's film, but I know some of that was recycled footage, so they didn't really prioritize it. Here, this is all new footage, and they shot a lot of it with miniatures, if you can believe that.
Well, I believe, yeah, they're great.
They had a 6-foot ship, and they had to slow the footage down so that the water would behave in a way a vast body of water as opposed to a small little body of water.
Yeah, they almost did it Toho style, It's they shot it like Godzilla films.
Looks super cool. Really like this sequence. I love that Dracula takes multiple forms here. We see the hand in the coffin. He becomes a wolf at one point.
Yeah, we get that great shot of his arm bursting out.
Yes, and a great gore moment when he claws that one guy's throat out.
They're gonna rest on that shot a lot in a couple scenes, when they discover the Demeter has been beached, and they show the captain they show his throat for so much.
Yes, they do. So of course the Demeter crashes outside of the Seward Sanitarium. This is where we kind of get introduced to the rest of our cast here. Some of them we get introduced to Lucy, her father Dr. Jack Seward, and her friend Mina. And Mina races out to find Dracula washed ashore, right? He's the only survivor of this crash.
Yeah.
And it's the first of many times he does this. This was a signature thing for Langella as much as it was for Lugosi, although they have slightly different styles here. But the hand work is very important to both. So I love that our first real glimpses of Dracula are the hands.
We got to take a second, just mention this asylum is a true nut house. This is a crazy place. People are running, they're not even in rooms.
Yeah, this was another one of those sequences where I thought Coppola's taken notes. But also, this idea of a sanitarium also kind of wouldn't be surprised to find that Terry Gilliam was inspired when he made 12 Monkeys.
That's a good reference there, for sure. Yeah, it has that same energy, of that same manic energy.
I think that was shot at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. And that was, I think, revolutionary in terms of the prison's architecture, in that it had a center that acted as a hub, and then there was were these like hallways that would go out around the hub, and then they had the outer wall. So it almost looked like a big wheel. This depiction of a sanitarium, very similar, right? You have that sort of column in the middle, and then everything branches off of that. So yeah, really enjoy Dr. Seward's hospital here, because we don't get any glimpses of that in Tod Browning's film.
Yeah, you don't even get a good sense of like he's this kind of doctor, like manning the asylum, or at least in the Coppola version, like the guy is on morphine trying to deal with his job. It's like driving him insane.
So great opening sequence there. I love the way Dracula he's invited to dinner, and that it's very similar to the Tod Browning film. The characters in the room are having a conversation, and then the maid announces Count Dracula as if to finish their sentence, but they're introducing him.
Yeah, it was this very speak of the devil moment.
Yeah, it's not quite like that. Actually, I think in this case, it is Sylvester McCoy, and you just hear Count Dracula. He comes walking into the room, and I love the similarities here to the original film. Just kind of getting to know this outsider from another town.
One of the differences that I found to be kind of jarring is, you get the great scene of the salvage of the Demeter, where they're like taking all of Dracula's crap. They're talking about how Mina found him, and
Yes.
and Renfield's like, oh, I gotta haul this all the way to the Abbey, boo me. And then he gets there, and we see Dracula very, very briefly for the first time, and Renfield's like, I ain't hauling anymore, there's dirt. And then he just full on jumps at him, turns into a bat, and attacks Renfield.
Yep.
And it's very fast. It's kind of not really shot great, and it's one of the moments that felt rushed. It felt like they're trying to fit Renfield in here, where like there's really no room for him, unfortunately, because he's a great character.
Yeah, he's definitely sort of shoehorned into this story. And, Renfield's a famous character in Dracula, and it felt like he was added because he needed to be, not because they had anything for him to do. But I did like the detail. So when they're at the wreck of the Demeter, we're introduced to this Jonathan Harker when they have their interaction together. Renfield accuses him of selling his house out from under him. So he's got like a grudge against Harker.
He also overcharged for the Abbey, and he's like, I'm going to tell Count Dracula that you cheated me out of my house, and then you charged him like too much for it.
Yeah. I mean, I do love that there's that little bit of history there. It's a little bit different, but again, ultimately Renfield doesn't amount to anything, as we've sort of established here, unfortunately. But I like this sequence where they're all kind of like having dinner. It's where we get the dancing and the I don't drink wine.
We also get like the Lucy mind control stuff. Like we learned that encounter, like in the beach cave, he definitely fed on her.
For sure.
Like there's so much implied like between scenes. Like it kind of keeps you on your toes from time to time to be like, I didn't miss anything, but like something definitely happened that they didn't show in detail intentionally. Like they want to be coy about some of this stuff. I think that's like an artistic choice, Do
you think that maybe they cut too many corners? Like the fact that we are so familiar with the Dracula story, like our mind is just filling in the blanks that they left?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening. I don't think a more sort of savvy viewer who's like doing a podcast about Dracula or something, like they might not have this kind of like recall for the details and all that stuff. And I also think that there's like they set up an expectation there for there to be more gore, and they really pull back, like the opening sequence, the wreck of the Demeter when they're up shore, like they constantly cut to all of like the horror of like that's happened. I think they end up pulling too many punches.
Again, it's hard for me to be objective. At a certain point, I remember thinking to myself with each new Spider-Man movie, thinking like, okay, I really hope they don't show us the whole origin. We don't need to see Uncle Ben die again. Actually, Batman's the better example. I don't need to see them die anymore. This movie's starting with the Voyage of the Demeter, maybe having a shorthand. Like I didn't notice it. It's hard for me to be critical in that way because I'm maybe too close to it.
Yeah,
I'd be curious to know what somebody thinks who's not so intimately familiar with Dracula, because our minds kind of fill in those blanks. We're so familiar with it.
Maybe the box office spoke a little bit on that, right? It was just like people who weren't able to jive with it were the ones that weren't previously familiar with it, hadn't read the book, didn't know the play, hadn't seen the 1930s movie. It might not even have been available readily. No VHS. I got to find a revival house. So like Dracula at this point, like the idea could have been like we need to kind of re-inject it into the public consciousness somehow. Like let's do a big marquee movie about him. Let's get him back in everybody's mind. Let's get him talking. But then, like what happened this year, those 3 other Dracula movies are out there too, or at least vampire adjacent movies. So it kind of drains a lot of the blood out of this one.
At this dinner party, Mina, like, she's obviously in some poor health. Before they can inject her with any kind of sort of medicines, Dracula uses his vampiric hypnotism, whatever you want to call it, more handwork, sort of brings life back to her. But of course, he's just trying to prepare her for later. After everyone has gone home, Mina and Lucy are sleeping in the same bed. In the play, I think it's more clear that it's more just because she's ill and they didn't want to leave her by herself. Lucy runs off in the middle of the night to be with Jonathan, and that's when Dracula... There's a great sequence here. This is from the novel, or at least not this particular scene, but Dracula scaling the side of the building like a lizard.
Yeah.
That's taken right from the journal entries of Jonathan Harker in Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Works so well here. Like, I bought it 100%. There's this weird floating slow-mo going on, and then when he gets to the window and he looks in, like, that really shocked me. I think that's the scariest shot, and I think that's a genuinely scary shot in the movie. It reminded me of the kids outside the window in Salem's Lot, same year, right? It just gave me the all-around, very scared, I'm gonna go around the house and like pull all of my shades right now.
I heard that particular shot, so he's clawing at the window, and then the camera pans to the left, and Dracula's face moves into frame, but he's upside down. There was some worry that would be seen as silly, but apparently it worked like gangbusters with their test audiences. It never amounted to laughter, so you are right. I think it's a really effective shot, but I can see why they would be worried about it, because it is a little bit strange.
But they should have been a little more worried about, like, the fog machines. You know, like, it's cool, it creates great atmosphere, but it's obvious, right? Like, there's more obvious things to kind of complain about than, like, this is a cool, innovative, different shot we're doing here where Dracula is really, you know, awkward and like throws you off, and then the next shot is almost just like right out of Saturday Night Fever. I don't know. Sometimes I'm not sure what this movie wants, but it's never bad. I'm not saying that's bad. I'm not saying that because, like, in a weird way, like, not only Dracula, but Langella is pulling off this, I'm not calling him disco Dracula or nothing, but like just different, right? Like, maybe it's just the times that he's bringing. I mean, he's bringing the modern era with him.
I get what you're saying about the fog machines. Like, I think about that image of him coming through the door. The doors are open, the fog's rolling through, and his shirt is sort of kind of unbuttoned. It kind of looks like the cover of like one of those trashy romance novels. I think that's the vibe we're going for.
I think you nailed it. I think you just nailed it, because that has that blend of people take this seriously, but deep down, it's not. We can sort of show that it's fun without making fun of it. Like, there's fun stuff to be done with this without making it a joke. And I think you nailed it with like that kind of soap opera or almost like romance novel.
Yeah, well, the thing about fantasies generally is that when you step back and look at them sort of out of context, they are kind of silly. You know, when you place this scene into this movie with everything else around it, it doesn't strike me as super silly. It's only when you isolate it and you think, okay, well, there's Langella with the hair, the fog.
Yeah, you take it out of context. You just show someone that picture and they might be like, what?
Right.
Yeah, but you watch the movie, they're earning it.
I mean, it's not Fabio, but it is kind of in that realm as far as like erotic imagery at the time.
Yeah.
The following morning, Mina dies.
Yeah, that's crazy.
This is a horrifying death. She sort of suffocates, which I've never seen before. But that's when they make the call to Van Helsing. This is when they have that breakfast I mentioned earlier, which is Seward is so detached in that scene from the death of his daughter's friend and the death of his friend's daughter. Like, he's just like stuffing himself with this like awful looking breakfast, if I can be honest about it. Apparently that is a very accurate representation of like an English breakfast. It looks so gross on screen. I apologize to our listeners in the UK. I've had a number of UK foods. I really enjoy British food, but in this particular scene of this particular film, the breakfast looks abominable.
There's that crazy moment while Mina's like suffocating to death and dying that Donald Pleasance comes in and starts slapping the shit out of her face. He's just like slaps her like, what's wrong? Wake up, breathe. He's slapping her and she just dies in his arms. I was like, oh, What?
So now with Van Helsing in town, there's also Dracula had invited Dr. Seward and Lucy and Jonathan over to Carfax Abbey.
Yeah, for like the repass or something, right? They're like, after the funeral, like, come to my spot. I'll host dinner and everything. And we kind of skipped over it quickly. I just want to mention, like, there is a little more Renfield in here. He kind of makes it to the asylum during all this, but he acts very Gollum. It's the first time I really put that together, is that even Dwight Fry kind of had like a precious kind of thing going on. So I thought that was an interesting take. They could have really, that's something they really could have sunk their teeth into with this version of Renfield.
Well, the other thing Dwight Fry was capable of, among many other things, is that his Renfield kind of wavers back and forth between sanity and insanity. You know, there are times where I feel like he's very lucid, and then there are times where he's an absolute maniac. It's really difficult to pin him down. This particular Renfield, again, we're going to reiterate, there's just not enough of him. But I think there's just not a lot to this character. And so Tony Haygarth only really gets one thing to play. Once he starts eating bugs, that's really all he does.
Yeah.
So with Jonathan indisposed and Dr. Seward going to meet Van Helsing at the train station, Lucy goes to Carfax by herself, and that is the beginning of this vampire love affair.
It's so crazy because she knows that like Renfield escaped from this in Jonathan's car, right? Like he jumps out of the back seat. Remember that part? And he's like, save me, save me. And Jonathan like beats the crap out of him. And he's like, oh, it's you, Renfield. And then he takes him to the asylum. And Lucy's like, I don't care. Like, I'm going to go to dinner alone at the Count's. It's all good. It's actually... There's the most beautiful photography in this sequence when they're at dinner and they're framed by all those candles. Like, that's insane. That's like Kubrick level lighting with candles right there.
I wrote that down in my notes. So many candles, torches. Who's lighting all this shit?
Yeah, he doesn't have like his brides. He doesn't have like his gypsies. Like he doesn't have, or his whatever they were, you know, he had those like henchmen and stuff. Like he doesn't control the underworld like I thought he did. You know, they're very much relegated to the countryside in this one.
Yeah, if this was his Transylvania castle, then I could understand, okay, he's got all of these like underlings from the local populace, but here he's an outsider, he doesn't really know anybody. So I guess he's lighting all these himself.
Yeah, I guess he is. I mean, he is a patient man. But I do like when they asked him, like, oh, have you come to Carfax to settle down, you know, at that dinner scene? And he's like, by no means. He's like, I'm here to like sort of sow my wild oats. He's like, I'm on a wanderlust, basically, right? He's like, I've come to wander and be free. And he's like, oh, the doctor's like, so you have a lust for life? And he's like, very much so. That's really cool. I don't think we ever got a real reason why Dracula decided to leave Transylvania in the first place. I like that he's just sort of like, no, I've decided after like 500 years, I'm going to see the rest of the world and like spread my seed and like create a brood and all this. That's what he discusses later with Lucy, where they're like, you'll be my queen and we'll create children and we'll rule the world. And it's like, now we're getting somewhere.
Right. He's definitely not acting out of desperation, which is an interesting point of view for Dracula, because in other versions, I would even argue that the Lugosi version, even if I don't think it's explicitly implied, but you know, he sort of drained his resources locally, right? So now he needs to go find fresh blood someplace else, and so he moves from the country to the city. I think in the play, Van Helsing points out, because in the play, he arrives by plane, not by boat. I think he points out that Dracula lived out in the middle of the European country for hundreds of years. And then as soon as commercial airplanes were available, that's what allowed him to travel overnight to a more densely populated area. And so that's one of the things that when he finds out Dracula arrived by airplane, he suspects Dracula for that reason, because he obviously knows that vampires can't come out during the daylight.
Oh, that's great. We got to see that in a version. Oh, I really want to see that. That's fun.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Lucy has her night at Dracula's castle, and that's where she falls in love with him.
Yeah.
I have to believe that it is on some level her choice.
She says, I came on my own accord. She flat out states it.
Well, I mean, he's a vampire. I feel like
No, because he asks her when she like shows up, right? Like, what are you doing here? Where's everybody? You could have like something along the lines of like, you could have canceled. And
Sure.
She's like, I came, you know, I wanted to be here. Like, I didn't get the sense because of how she was set up as like this, like no joke, like she's portrayed as like, you know, strong, independent woman, like very forward, like that kind of thing. Like she's not going to do anything. A guy isn't going to force her to do that. You know what I'm?
Sure.
That's the vibe I was getting.
So you buy that she's there completely on her own.
I do. She wants more excitement out of life. Like she wants more than just the country with Jonathan the Drip, you know? Like the I would too.
Having watched them dance, I can certainly see that point of view.
Yeah, I could only imagine what their lovemaking's like, you know. And you know, and if I saw Dracula waltz into town too, it'd be like, yeah, that's a step up.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it works that way too. I just always kind of figure that Dracula is using some amount of manipulation at all times, but the film definitely does support your line of thinking.
I kind of like the reading more where Dracula is impressed that he doesn't need to use powers this time.
Yeah, that's a good point too. But this is where that seed gets planted that will eventually grow in later scenes as we get closer to the end. But she does stay the night. The following day, that's when the plans to investigate Mina's death begin. That's when the quote unquote real Van Helsing starts to come out. The occult, supernatural expert. As much as he comes out, this is where it comes out.
We get a good scene of him studying, and he's got like the garlic going on and the crosses and stuff, and he put the garlic on Lucy's grave. But we also get that crazy scene of something jumping out of a window of the asylum, and then all the screaming, and we find out that like Lucy ate a baby.
This is what is known in the novel as like the Boofer lady. In the novel, it's Lucy, but in the play and in this movie, it's Mina, and she is like this undead vampire version of herself that goes around at night harming kids. She's called the Boofer lady because the kids see her as this beautiful lady, but the way it comes out is this Boofer lady. It shows up in some versions of Dracula, not all. I was happy to see it show up here in some way. It's expanded on almost like pretty fully in like the BBC miniseries, the Stephen Moffat miniseries. I think the Tod Browning film gets rid of it entirely. The play definitely has it, but it's only ever mentioned in like passing, just like it is here. Yeah, so we know that Mina, this like vampire Mina, is out there wreaking havoc and stealing babies.
You get that shot of the baby too, and again, I'm like, man, we're so close. He keeps pulling back and then going for it, and then pulling back again, and like, you know, this is another moment where it's like, it is R-rated. That's the craziest thing. I mean, is it because of the shot of the baby? I mean, like, if you already got the R, like, really give us more, because I think it's very much like. Okay, so I was thinking of like how James Whale used to balance horror and comedy, and like you could also balance horror with romance really well. And like this would have been a really interesting time to be like, here's some like very unsettling gore, and now back to like the sex, or like let's titillate. So it's like these two opposite forms of like titillation, maybe. My mind was just sort of striving for a way to squeeze in more of the actual like kind of visual horror.
Yeah, this is a tame R-rated film for us, but I think that they kind of had to give it the R rating because of the violence. Not that it's super violent, like the Captain of the Demeter. You know, we see that.
Yeah, they linger. There's a lot of lingering on it. What is there, they do linger.
I'm sure if it were released today, it would get a PG-13. I'm looking at like the IMDb like breakdown of all the things that are in it, like sex, nudity, violence, gore, and all that. And really, it's just like lots of kissing as Dracula seduces women, some use of damn as, you know, profanity.
Cursing.
Yeah, no alcohol because Dracula never drinks wine. It's really just the violence, you know. So yeah, this gets Van Helsing thinking about vampires. And so the next step is to exhume Mina's body from the ground. That leads to that really cool sequence where like they dig down into the casket and they find that she has burrowed beneath the casket into these like underground passageways.
Yeah, that's crazy to me that that entire cemetery rests above these catacombs. Like, what if they dig too deep? Like, they're gonna burst right through the roof of those catacombs. It's cool and weird at the same time. Like, I wonder if they knew when they made the cemetery that those catacombs were under there.
It is an irresponsible location for a cemetery.
But it is a really awesome development when they open the casket and you see that she's like basically dug through her coffin, dug through the ground and dug away and like escaped.
Yeah, I think it makes for a cool visual, but it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to put a cemetery over like old. I think they're old like mine shafts or something.
It's almost like Indiana Jones logic, right? Where it's like we just need this to be here for adventure.
Yeah, there's a great scene there where they confront Mina. Now, the makeup here is a little bit strange to me because we see like the vampire Mina, who's not quite a vampire, right? She's not polished. She looks like something from The Evil Dead.
Yeah. You know what I was thinking though? Do you ever see Omega Man with Charlton Heston? It's sort of
No.
a remake of like I Am Legend or The Last Man on Earth, and like all like the quote unquote vampires in that are just people with like powder white makeup and black sunglasses walking around in dark robes,
Sure.
and it kind of got like that. And that was all. I think that was the late '60s, early '70s. But I was having the same vibe of like we didn't exactly give up, but like we don't really know what to do. You know, like how do you innovate the vampire? I think by making her white, it made me think of Herzog and Nosferatu. Like, you know,
Mhm.
maybe they were kind of trying to glom off of that a little bit. I think the eyes are still cool. The eyes are always really cool.
Yeah, it looks cool. It just looks strange in this movie, I think.
Because we don't see anything really else like this again. Again, it's like the Bond title sequence love scene, right? Like there are just every once in a while there are these flourishes that feel beyond the movie and stylistically, maybe.
And speaking of that scene, that's pretty much the next big sequence. Lucy is summoned back to Carfax Abbey. This is like what John Badham would refer to as like the wedding night. And it is where Lucy gives herself over to Dracula entirely. There's a love scene with lasers and smoke, and it is what it is. Love it or hate it.
Well, I'll tell you why I like it. I like it because I don't have to see these actors like try to have sex on screen. One
Mm,
thing, like that would be super awkward. Like I don't need to see Dracula like actually having sex, right?
sure.
And I like the idea that like it's interpretive. Like it's almost like interpretive dance, but like sex. So like this is what's going on in their heads. Like I'm cool with like let it be ethereal or something. Like let it be this like dark magic that they're sharing. Like I think it gets the point across that something supernatural is happening during this coitus.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this is where Lucy allows the blood swap to happen. You know, she's got a drink of his blood and all of that. From this point on, she is now infected with Dracula's blood, starts to undergo some of those similar changes to Lucy, right? The way we saw Lucy at the beginning of the film. That leads, of course, to the whole blood transfusion bit. Jonathan just giving as much blood as he possibly can.
Maybe the one sequence I really like with Van Helsing is when he faces off with Dracula in his study.
Mm.
I called it like round one. That was really cool. That's where we get the no reflection. That's where we get Dracula saying he's alive for 500 years. He tries to hypnotize Van Helsing, all that stuff.
A lot of that scene is written like verbatim from a scene in the play, and that's when I realized they took this straight from the play for Tod Browning's film too, because if you pay attention to the dialogue, a lot of it is the same. So specifically, in the past 500 years, Professor, those who have crossed my path have all died, some not pleasantly. That's taken right from the play. But then you get, you're a wise man, Professor, for someone who has not lived even a single lifetime, but not wise enough to return to Holland at once now that you have learned what you have learned.
Yeah, that's a good line for someone who hasn't even lived a single lifetime. Yet he's talking to like an 88-year-old man who's like clearly lived one long life.
Those lines also were spoken by Lugosi. When it comes to the play, or at least the script of the play, this is the scene that is most ripped from that source material. So we're getting a lot of extra stuff that Langella did not play on stage, kind of wrapped around this one scene. You always have this scene in a Dracula movie where Dracula and Van Helsing have that moment where they understand one another and what their roles are going to be with each other going forward. If that's the scene, if you're going to borrow anything from this play, that's the scene, because that scene is so damn good.
Yeah, it fits great. And then he jumps out of the window and turns into a dog. Like that was so smooth. That shot, that trick shot, you know, I love that.
So John Badham did a commentary track for the Blu-ray. Apparently, he had to constantly remind Olivier to keep his mouth closed throughout the filming because he had this tendency to like have his mouth just open.
Okay.
Badham thought having a closed mouth would project a stronger, more confident character, which I totally agree with. However, when they shot that sequence, when Dracula like lunges out of the window and transforms into a wolf, he went to give Olivier a note, and Olivier like immediately was like, "Don't tell me to keep my mouth shut," because I've just seen a man leap out of a window and turn into a wolf. If there's ever a time where my mouth should be open, like, this is it.
Here, here.
I do love that he held his ground in that moment.
Your mouth would be agape too. Take a week for you to shut that mouth.
I love that sequence. As much as I don't think that Olivier is a fantastic Van Helsing, this scene is really great. Having a young, like super talented Frank Langella acting across from this legend. Great scene. And I like some of the effects work in that too. I mean, it's simple effects. They use it a couple times in the movie. I mean, it's technically like a split screen where they shoot the scene twice, where they use one side of the frame of one take and the other side of the frame for the other take, so that they could shoot Olivier standing in the mirror, seeing his reflection. And then when Dracula walks through the door, you see him come through the door, but in the mirror, in the reflection, he is not there. They use it later when they're examining Mina's body, when they're proving to Jonathan that she doesn't have a reflection. So he holds that mirror towards her face and she doesn't have that reflection. So it's just simple editing trick. Really enjoy that, really effective. Okay, so now it's down to Van Helsing and Jonathan to pursue Dracula. The next big confrontation they have is in Dracula's castle. They're there with the intent to stake him to death, but he's there waiting for them.
I love this twist on it, right? Because I was like, oh, the movie's going to be over soon. Like, they're going to stake Dracula at his house. And then they get there and he's like, dude, it's my house.
Yeah.
They screw up like every beat and I love it.
This movie sort of, I don't know if it rewrites a rule, but it certainly, I think, took advantage of something that I hadn't considered before. Jonathan and Van Helsing go over there during the daytime, assuming he's going to be in the coffin asleep. But he explains that it's always daytime somewhere on Earth. And so it's not the daytime, like he doesn't need to sleep during the day. It's just that he has to remain in the shadows when the sun's out. Yeah. He can be awake any time of day.
That was a little bit in the Coppola one. He walked around during the day when he came to London when he is at full power.
That's true.
So, yeah. So like if he's really strong and young looking and virile, like he can chill out and go see a movie or something.
Yeah, that Dracula didn't immediately burst into flames as he stepped outside. Yeah, you're right.
But this is a good way of putting it. It's kind of like, well, the sun's always out, so that's not the rule. It's like it's exposure.
Right.
It's more like he's allergic to the sun. He doesn't have to be asleep though. Non-vampires stay up to like 3 or 4 in the morning. I'm sure he's up to like 2 or 3 in the afternoon.
So it's a great scene. I already sort of described the effect shot when they attack with the shovel. He escapes.
Yeah, they burn him a little bit. Like he starts biting on Jonathan as a bat, and then they like open up the window to singe him with the sunlight, and he flies off as a bat, and they regroup.
Yes, and by this point, Lucy is well under his influence and has been kept at the sanitarium. So she's got her own like cell there. So Dracula escapes in this moment and rushes to the sanitarium to retrieve Lucy and to kill Renfield.
Yeah, that's a cool sequence. That's a great plan too. He's like, I got to make one stop and take care of 2 things.
Yes. A really great effects scene. I mean, as much as this Renfield is kind of useless, I did enjoy the scene where he's begging for his life and then gets his head twisted around.
Yeah, that was a crazy prop. When the head twists around like that, I was caught so off guard. Like that's what this movie does well. There's good timing with these gags, right? With the mixing in the practicals and like we mentioned with all the inflatables, like all the timing is really good on it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Again, I mentioned this before, but it's clear that Coppola watched this movie because so much of that movie was done in camera. I think he understood the value of the practical effects as opposed to CGI. This movie was before CGI, so they kind of had to do it this way. But I like that Coppola saw how much better these effects can look when you do it all practically. So he kills Renfield and then he absconds with Lucy. But before that, there is a great scene with her and Jonathan, and that's the scene with the sort of batwing dress that she's wearing. She almost gets Jonathan in the neck, and we see her with the funky eyes and the teeth.
It's a more effective on her in this sequence because she's like back and forth. Lucy looks scary and everything like that, but the idea that, I mean, Mina, sorry, in this one, Mina looks scary in her crypt and all that kind of stuff. But the idea here, like, of the character Lucy being out of control, like she's shifting back and forth like that. Like, I like that concept, like that's really cool.
Yeah. Well, she's still early on in this transformation.
Yeah.
So he mentions at one point that he's saving her transformation for, I guess, when they get back to Transylvania. He says something about how she has to remain like a creature of the daytime or something like that. I can't remember exactly his phrasing, but I did like that he's kind of like waiting for them to be away from all this so that they can complete that transformation and spend the rest of eternity together. So
Yeah, after that attack and everything, their plan is to kind of just skip town. Let's get back to my place where it's safe.
yeah, and that's exactly what he does. The one thing I remembered about the sanitarium, but after he kills Renfield, I love that he turns into a mist. It's one of those things, like I love watching vampires like just do vampire shit. Instead of just turning into a bat, we see him become a wolf, we see him become a mist, we see him do other stuff. Just love that little detail there.
I loved how the movie was also like, silver bullets aren't going to work, you jerk.
Oh yeah.
Wrong monster.
But Dracula grabs Lucy and gets their like coffins together, and basically they end up on like a wagon.
Something was cut here, right? This was so jarring.
It's like this wagon that's headed for the coast.
Okay, so 1 minute they're crawling down the side of the asylum together, and Dracula's like running with her in his arms. And then the three guys, like they get in their car and they start driving to Carfax Abbey. But it's like on the way, they bump into some dude in a wagon, and he's like, I'm hauling these crates to the port. And they're like, crates? Those must be Dracula in there. And I'm like, what? What do you mean? And so they start chasing the out of control car because it's like the horses have been influenced by Dracula in the dirt, and it's out of control. And there's this kind of fun car chase at the end of this movie. I was very shocked.
Yeah, it was super cool. I didn't write it down, but I read the side of that like wagon that they were traveling in. I remember the driver's name was Hindley, but I can't remember what it said on the side, but essentially it was like a parcel delivery. So they basically hijacked like an early FedEx truck and decided they're going to take that all the way to safety.
That's crazy.
That was pretty fun.
Again, that was another thing. Like, that's not something I could infer because I've seen Dracula movies before, because we're off book now. This is all new stuff. So, like, that's when I was like, okay, I've watched like hundreds of movies. You could put this together. Is that Dracula in the back of that wagon? It is. Oh, man. Can't believe they just did that in a cut.
Yeah, this ending is entirely different from any other Dracula iteration I've ever seen, which is cool. I love if you're going to do something different, that's great. Show me something new.
I absolutely love everything that happens from here on out, except Van Helsing dying. But I gotta tell you, I love all of this stuff with him getting on the boat. They have to chase the boat. They fight on the boat. That's smart. Like, there's such a sense of anxiety. Like, they're not gonna catch him.
Yep, but it is daytime. So, it's going to be a tricky escape for Dracula, right? I mean, he's got to stay below deck, but now he's got Van Helsing and Jonathan Harker right on top of him. And the fight scene is great. I love that Lucy, like, immediately goes for Jonathan, and he's struggling, and Van Helsing can't help him because Dracula's the priority. So really great sequence. But ultimately, Van Helsing manages to impale Dracula, like as he's dying, manages to impale Dracula with this hook.
Yeah, so he comes at Dracula with a stake, and Dracula just turns it right around on him and like impales him like on the wall of the ship, like he's hanging there. It looks very painful. Yeah, and then he turns his attention to Jonathan, but then Van Helsing grabs like you said, it's like a giant hook. It's attached to a bunch of rope, and he throws it at Dracula, and it like catches him right in the back perfectly.
And they're able to like crank that thing all the way up through the deck of the ship and like way up into the sails, right?
Up to the crow's nest, like in the mast. So it must have been some kind of hook or utility to raise a sail of some type.
Right. That exposes Dracula to the sun. There's an okay sequence here where he starts to like catch fire. His face blisters.
Yeah, he's not on fire enough for my liking.
No, he doesn't
not
like
nearly enough.
He doesn't like immediately spark, does he?
I just thought he would go up and then like instantly be ablaze, and that was going to be the end. You know, you'd hear him like screaming on fire.
I expected a little more dramatic finish for Dracula here, but Langella, I don't think, wanted to do anything over the top. I think he really protected his interpretation of the character and wanted to keep it understated as much as possible. So
it just seems like he grew super old in a super fast amount of time. Oh, now that he's dying, he's just going to age to death.
But we don't know if he dies because in one of the more interesting turns, Lucy, who's still alive, sees Dracula's shape flying through the air.
What I thought it was that like his cape just got caught by the wind and started floating away into the sky. But I think she thinks he's in it and like he got away.
So that's what the movie wants us to sort of think about. I don't know that there was ever immediately thought of a sequel, but I think they wanted to have it end in such a way that it could be the end of Dracula, or if they wanted to make a sequel, they'd still be able to. So instead we get this sort of ambiguous ending where we really just see like the cape take off into the wind, but it's got like a rigid kind of humanoid shape to it. So Dracula might be in there.
It feels like there's something in it. Maybe he turned into a bat before he finally got, you know, and then got covered by the sun from his cape and flew away in his cape. I don't know.
But what I like about this moment, like I think it's like the final shot or definitely the final moments, is Kate Nelligan's performance, right? Because she was in love with Dracula and now he's dead, probably dead. And she's like watching this cape sail off into the wind and she looks like she could be hopeful, like maybe the whole thing's over, or maybe he's still alive, or maybe she's sad that he's gone. Like it's really difficult to read her face. I think she's kind of doing a little bit of all of that all at once. Really great wordless performance from her in those final moments.
I agree. I like her performance. I think she played it perfectly in that final shot too. I think she's conveying all those things, like whatever you kind of feel happened. Like I feel like she's saying, yeah, like it could be that. Personally, I think what I see is like she still loves Dracula and she hopes that one day he's going to return. But I think deep down she knows he's not coming back.
Well, that is the end of Dracula. I hope we got to everything. I think we did.
We hit all the most important parts.
I think with that, it's almost time for us to race back to the shadows. But before we do, I'm happy to report we've got some monster mail.
All right. Love mail.
This was sent to us back in May. We had wrapped by that point, so we really didn't have a way to address it on the air. So some of this isn't necessarily relevant anymore, but there's some really cool stuff in this email. So I wanted to read it on the air anyway. So this comes from Kevin Irvin. Hi, guys. My name is Kevin Irvin, and I just wanted to say that I love the podcast. As a monster kid growing up in the 60s and 70s, during maybe the height of the monster craze, I grew up loving everything to do with monsters. I read Creepy, Eerie, Vampirella, and of course, famous monsters of Filmland. Monster cards, monster-themed games, and monster toys consumed every penny of my allowance. I can still remember the thrill of going to the local Woolworths to buy the latest Aurora monster model in stock.
Oh, wow.
I love this. And I especially love that he referenced famous monsters of Filmland. I don't know how many people may have noticed our logo was sort of inspired by the Monster Club pins that you could get from famous monsters of Filmland. Let's see. He says, you guys do a fantastic job of breaking down the movies that ruled my childhood and that I still enjoy, even though I've seen most of them dozens of times. Having said all that, I'd like to ask a favor. Don't stop.
Don't worry.
There are plenty of Universal movies left for you to view and dissect, and not just Universal movies. How about digging up some of the great B movies from the 50s? The Fly, The Colossal Man, Giant Mantis, The Thing. They could all use a going over by everyone's favorite gruesome twosome.
Is that us?
That's us.
Oh, thanks. I love that.
So how about it, boys? Give it a thought, won't you? Yes, Kevin, we've definitely considered doing stuff outside of Universal. I don't know if that would be part of this show or if we spin it off into something else entirely. I can say for sure, without a doubt, 100% that I enjoy the dynamic that we have on this show and would, you know, like Mike, I'll talk to you about anything. So yeah, I think that always possible that we could get to stuff outside of Universal. I definitely love plenty of horror, and I think we could definitely make that work. It's just a matter of finding time.
And we definitely want to do more. So stick with us as we try.
Yes. He also has a question for us. In the early 60s, 1966, I was introduced to my first horror movie, Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, via the Dr. Cadaverino show in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Oh, cool.
I was 6. I soon moved to Chicago, where I watched the original Svengoolie, and then years later, current Sven, all of whom showed the Universal Shock package of movies.
Nice. Yeah, I watch Svengoolie still.
My question is this: how did you guys get introduced to the classic monster movies? Through a local horror host like myself or other means? And what was the first monster movie you saw? What was the first Universal monster movie you saw? Inquiring minds want to know. Thanks again for doing the great job and hopefully bringing these movies to light for some new viewers. Yours truly, Kevin Irvin, Kenosha, Wisconsin.
Okay.
Great email. Thank you, Kevin.
That was terrific.
So we're not stopping, so don't worry about that. We're going to keep doing this as long as we possibly can. So where do we first get introduced to classic monster movies? I feel like we talked about this in our intro episode. Yeah.
Episode 0. Yeah.
Kevin, you should be able to find that, but let me see if I can remember. I mean, I've told this story a couple times personally that somehow my household as a kid, we acquired Frankenstein and the Mummy on VHS, and those were the ones we had in the house. That was like my introduction to Universal monsters.
I think if I'm not mistaken, I mentioned like WPIX Channel 11 in my area growing up, like not just Godzilla, but I used to run some of the old Universal horror movies and all that. I knew about, but didn't really dive into this Universal stuff until much later. You know, as a kid, I was aware of all these guys.
As far as like being a kid and what else I like discovered, and I remember the monsters I've mentioned a couple times on the show. Was integral to my childhood. So, and I also loved the monster cereals. Count Chocula was a favorite of mine. Still is. Still buy it every year. So, thank you again, Kevin, for writing us. If you out there in podcast land, if you would like to ask us questions, comment to the show, we'll read your emails on the air. So you can contact us at themonstersThatMadeUs@gmail.com. But I think that's it for our episode. This is our first episode back. Not a bad one. We will be back Friday, November 24th, jumping ahead.
Really far ahead.
To 1999, to possibly the greatest movie year ever, some might say, to discuss 1999's The Mummy. You can follow us on X, the social media site formerly known as Twitter, at Monster Made Pod. We're also on Blue Sky at Monster Made Pod. But for now, Twitter X seems to still be more or less the site that we loved using. So we're still on there, most active there. Also pretty active on Instagram at The Monsters That Made Us, Facebook at The Monsters That Made Us. You can follow me pretty much everywhere at Dan Colon. Mike, where can listeners find you?
You can also find me pretty much everywhere at _Mikester. That's Instagram and X, Twitter. And you can find all the other shows I do on the network at cageclub.me.
If you enjoyed this episode and you want to become a Patreon supporter, you can do so at patreon.com/themonstersthatmadeus. You can also support the show by giving us a 5-star rating and review on iTunes. And we can't forget about our t-shirts on TeePublic. You can find the link for that in our aforementioned Twitter and Instagram bios. And for all other things Cage Club related, just head on over to cageclub.me. That's cageclub.me. Stay spooky, everybody.